Well, a very pleasant good morning to each one of you. As I was driving here yesterday, my mind started thinking about trips in the past and times that I slept next door here. I was with you when Shane Scott was preaching here, when Art Adams was preaching here. I've held many gospel meetings for other churches in the area. I've been at what was the old Highland Street Church, the Woodmar Church, the Hespel Church, the Hobart Church, so I have a lot of memories in this area. Some of you I remember from trips in the past. Some of you I'm meeting for the first time today. But I want you to know that I did not feel that I was coming to be with strangers today. I felt I was coming to be with God's family. And so I'm very thankful for the invitation and very thankful that I get to be here. And I hope that everything that we say and do today will be to His honor and glory. Now, let me tell you in the very beginning, you don't have to have a passport, but we're going to go around the world today. And if I can accomplish one thing, what I want to accomplish is to help you be appreciative of who you are and where you are, and appreciative for what you have. We often take many things for granted. I'm now 72 years old. I don't mind sharing that. I've been trying to preach the gospel for 52 years. And I worked with the East Side Church in Bowling Green. That was the last congregation I worked with. I had preached in Indiana for 6 years. Helped start a new church outside of Lexington in the little town of Paris, Kentucky. I worked there for 6 years. Worked near Mammoth Cave for 3 years. Back to Bowling Green, where I was born and reared, and worked for the East Side Church for 18 years. And then I made a choice one year after a lot of thought and many prayers, is that I gave up my salary and I resigned from the local pulpit. And now for the last 18 years is that I have been pretty exclusively been doing foreign work. There was a burning in my heart that just what I mentioned a few moments ago, how many churches that I have preached for in just this general area. And then I go to countries where there's one preacher in the whole country. I made trips to Sweden and Denmark, and I could not find one Christian. And that bothered me. The United States has 10% of the world's population. But we have 91 to 92% of all known gospel preachers. Now let that sink in. We have 10% of the population, but 90% of every known gospel preacher in the world. And so I decided to devote myself to try to go to some of these places and to try to find men with honest hearts, men that wanted to work, to study, and that we would offer some pretty extensive Bible classes. Now, Jeremy has made a couple of trips with me to the Philippines. I have made 29 trips to the Philippines. I've made 12 trips to Zimbabwe. I've made 14 trips to South Africa. And what I'm going to show you today is places around the world where that things are not as well off as they are in Portage, Indiana. People ask me, say, Bob, when you go overseas, what is your purpose? What is your mission? And I really have two purposes. Number one, in my Bible classes around the world, I realize that there are some things that have been put into people's head that's not in the Bible. So my mission is to pull that out of their head and throw it away. Now, I'll give you an example. Right here in Portage, we could go around the neighborhood and ask people, well, what was the fruit that Adam and Eve ate? And what do you think some of them are going to say? They're going to say an apple. Well, the Bible doesn't say that, so I want to pull it out and throw it away. You ask some of the people, well, when Jesus was born, how many wise men came to visit the baby? You know what they're going to say? Three. The Bible doesn't say that, so I want to pull it out and throw it away. But then there are thousands of things that the Bible does tell us that some people don't know. So I want to study and put that into the head. Does that make sense? The Bible is the most amazing book that the world has ever known. 66 books written by 40 different authors over a period of 1,500 years, and it contains 10,000 stories. Now, if I had the time, I'd start over here and say, what's your favorite Bible story? And so if someone said, well, that's when Mr. Noah built the ark. Well, great. If you know that story, there's only 9,999 more to learn. So if your favorite story is that little man Zacchaeus that climbed up in the tree where he could see Jesus, now we know 2 stories. There's only 9,998 more to learn. You see, learning the Bible is like going to Africa and eating an elephant. You just do it one bite at a time. Now, let me ask you, how many stories do you think you know? And when you come back next Sunday and sit in the same spot where you're sitting right now, are you going to know a new Bible story next week that you don't know today? That's my challenge when I'm trying to teach around the world. Now, I'm not in the same league with the Apostle Paul, but I want to borrow a verse from Dr. Luke when he recorded this in the book of Acts that talks about Paul coming back from his preaching journey. And in Acts chapter 14 and verse 27, it says, and when they were come and had gathered the church together, they rehearsed all that God had done with them. So I am with you at your invitation this morning, and we have gathered the church together, and now I want to rehearse with you what God has done. Now, Bob might be the one that gets on the airplane. I might be the one that sleeps under a tree in Africa. I might be the one that eats the barbecue dog in the Philippines. But I don't consider these to be Bob's trips. I consider these to be God's trips. I'm just simply the little messenger boy. And so when I'm traveling around the world, my job is not to make Americans out of people. My job is to make Christians out of people. Now, I mentioned that Jeremy has traveled with me in the past, and I have taken a little over 100 people with me overseas. Some have gone with me to China, some have gone with me to Vietnam, some have gone with me to Kenya, to Ghana, to Zimbabwe, to Tanzania, to Russia. And so the one thing that I remind them of, some of you remember watching the movie on television, The Wizard of Oz. And you remember after that tornado, that Dorothy said, Toto, we're not in Kansas anymore. Well, if you agree to go with me on a preaching trip overseas, I try to drill into your head, we're not in America anymore. And I do not want to hear on this trip, I do not want to hear, well, that's the way we do it in America. We're not in America anymore. And we respect the independence and the autonomy of the local churches. Now, things are different many times with culture. Things are different in the arrangement of our services. Is that sometimes, I was in one church in Europe, and they had 3 prayers before they ever had the first song. I'd never seen that done that way before. But the church has requested, this man will have a prayer of thanksgiving, this man will have a prayer of intercession, this man will pray for evangelism. I was mentioning at the dinner table last night, and I appreciated so much the wonderful meal we had, and appreciated even more the association and the conversation we had. But I was mentioning when I was in Bogota, Colombia, the ladies took turns each Sunday. They would bring a little plastic bag of grapes, and they would go into a room back there, and they would squeeze the grapes, and we would have the fresh grape juice. I'd never seen that done before. That's fine. I don't care whether it's red grapes, white grapes, or purple grapes. Sometimes we visit places and they have the store-bought bread, and other places like today, we have the homemade bread. I'm concerned of doing what God wants in a scriptural way. But there are many times that it can be different than what we are used to. Now, I'm old enough. I make a joke about that. I'm so old, I remember when the Dead Sea was just sick. But you see, when I first started preaching, to go and hold a gospel meeting, preachers would paint their sermon outline on a bed sheet. Now, only you older people might remember that. The younger generation has no idea what I'm talking about. I can remember when we folded up and put away the sheets and we invested in a chalkboard. Somebody questioned whether or not we were going liberal. And then we went from the black chalkboard to the green chalkboard. Then we went from the green chalkboard to a white marker board. And now we've got colored markers, red and blue and green. And then we went from the white marker board to the overhead projector. And now we've moved from the overhead projector into the PowerPoint. See, we can teach the gospel in different climates, in different conditions. Now, many times in Zimbabwe, we don't have electricity. But I have, thanks to Jeremy's brother providing for us some laptop computers and some PowerPoint projectors, is that I've taken those into regions and we crank up a generator. And then we can use it, and then I leave that with the church there where they can use it for the future. Sometimes we have nothing to use. And so I have to teach classes. How do you teach a children's class when you've got no literature? You've got no visual aids. So I would just send the children outside and say, now, I don't want you to bring back something that man made. Bring back something that God made. And so they came in, one kid had some grass, and one kid had a flower, and one kid had a stone, and one kid had a bird feather. I'd say, all right, now, with whatever you brought in, tell me, what day did God create that? And so we had to study then Genesis 1 about creation. Now, if I were to ask you, can you tell me which day God made the bird? Can you tell me which day that he made the red rose? Which day did God make the giraffe? And so we would study then the days of creation. So we do things in a totally different way than what we might do it in this building here in Portage. So fasten your seatbelt and let's travel around the world. And let me tell you in the very beginning, for every photograph that I'm going to show you, there's a few hundred more of that same country that I will not have time to show you. For every story that I tell you, there's another 24 stories I could tell you that I won't have time. There was a church in Texas that invited me to come and stay with them for a whole week. And every night they wanted to look at a different country where I'd been. And so I had a lot more time and could show a lot more pictures and tell a lot more stories. Now, some of these I'm just going to show you just 2 or 3 pictures from that country so I can move on to another country. Just so you can appreciate what you've got. I'm going to start here with Indonesia. Now, I want you to see my friend Peter. Peter took vacation. He paid his own expenses, and he flew to Singapore, where that I was having a week-long Bible class there. We studied for 8 hours a day. And Peter decided to become a Christian. Now, you need to understand that Indonesia is a Muslim country, one of the areas of some of the most radical Muslims. Now, if you're caught trying to convert someone in Indonesia, you'll have your head cut off. Now, when I go to China, when I go to Vietnam, those are communist countries. If I'm caught teaching the Bible in a communist country, I can go to prison. Some of you may remember just a few years ago when Keith Barclay and some of my other friends went to China. They arrived at the hotel, they dropped off their luggage, and they said, now let's go down to McDonald's and get us a sandwich, and then we'll come back and unpack. And while they were sitting there at McDonald's eating their burgers, the soldiers came in and said, you need to go back to your hotel. They're in your room right now, going through your luggage and going through your computers. And then they were given a choice. We will either now escort you back to the airport, or we can escort you to prison. Which one do you want? Now, I think that you know what Keith and Kathy chose. But you see, their plan was to be there for 3 weeks. They were not there for 3 hours. And they were told, we don't want you to bring Christianity to our country. Now, in Indonesia, Peter was baptized in Singapore. And then he went back to Indonesia, happy to be a Christian. But for the first 3 weeks, he couldn't have the Lord's Supper. There was not another Christian in Indonesia. There was no one for him to sing with. There was no one for him to pray with. There was no one for him to have the communion with. Now, can you imagine, as a babe in Christ, being all alone? Finally, after 3 weeks, he was able to convert his father. And I was so excited. Of course, Peter was very excited. Now, 2 of them, one person does not make a church, but you can have 2 and have a church. And so they were able to have the Lord's Supper together. Sad thing, though, after a few months, his father accepted a job in Australia. And so now that leaves Peter all alone again. And so he struggled with that. And then finally, he converted his business partner. And so now Peter and Marlene could worship together, have the Lord's Supper together. Now, I have to step off the side for just a moment and tell you one strange story, talking about culture, is that after he converted his business partner, is that they told me that they owned this business together. And I said, well, what kind of business do you have? And they said, well, we own a store for adult toys. Well, now, when you say that in this part of Indiana, that has a very negative connotation to it, doesn't it? And it sort of scared me when they told me that they owned a shop for adult toys. So I later found out it's remote control cars and remote control helicopters, and what it is, it's toys that are so expensive children can afford them. But I told them what the word adult toys might mean in America, so they've changed the name of it now. But I want you to just look at that. Marlene has the dream that someday she can fly to America. She has the dream that someday that I could take her around and that she could visit a dozen different churches. That she could sit in a building like this and listen to all the voices blending together and singing praises to God. She's never heard that sound except on DVDs in the Sunday. She has the dream of someday sitting in a classroom with a whole bunch of Christian women, because she doesn't know Christian women. So as we continue with our slides, I want to plant a seed in your mind. And as Eric pointed out before the Lord's Supper, if we'll stop and think, I'm convinced if we'll stop and think, we will stop and thank. So I want you to say a special prayer today that you're thankful for the size of the congregation that you have, for all the brothers and sisters that can encourage you. Well, now let's leave Indonesia and let's travel now into Europe. I had made several trips in several countries where for many of my trips I couldn't find Christians. But now slowly in many of these countries there are now Christians. In Belgium, it's a different brother, same name, Peter. Spells in a different way. But Peter has a church that meets in his home. Now, on 2 of my trips, I stayed in his home. His wife was a very kind and gracious hostess. She was a great cook. She was a wonderful Bible teacher. She was a wonderful mother. She was a wonderful wife. And then sadly one day she just told Peter, I've been good my whole life and I don't want to be good anymore. I don't want to be a Christian anymore. I don't want to be married anymore. And I don't want my children anymore. And so she walked out. And so you can imagine the struggle that Peter has trying to be a preacher, trying to be a father. And so the church is very small. He converted his brother, you can see there on the left, and the sister-in-law. And then that's mommy over on the right. And so you've seen the whole church now. That's it. And they would love to assemble with a big crowd like what we have here today. But Peter stays busy 3 days of the week. He has Bible classes on the internet. He uses Skype. On this particular day, he asked me to assist him, and we were studying with two people. One was on an island off the coast of Africa, and one was on an island off the coast of Spain. And we were studying together here on Skype. Let's move then into Sweden, into Scandinavian country. Is that this is an area of wealth, and sadly it seems that wealth has become their god. Is that they just want to get richer and richer and richer. For several trips, I could not find a single Christian in Sweden. And finally, George migrated from Ghana to Sweden. He met Gabrielle. They fell in love. They got married. They have two children. The daughter is 24 years old. The son is in his last year of high school. And they were expecting a third child. And just 3 weeks ago, she had a miscarriage. So we do want to remember this family in our prayers. But you see, you're looking now at the first Christian that we knew among the Swedes. And so with George and Gabrielle helping to start a new church, the contribution on Sunday was large enough that they could afford to rent a room in this building right next to the train station. They had enough money only for Sunday morning worship. And then 2 nights during the week, they have Bible classes in the home. And so right here, you're seeing some others that are migrating in from Zimbabwe and from Ghana. So here's the whole church now that assembles on Sunday. So there again, you should be appreciative for what you have. In many countries where I go, we can stand on the street corner in just a couple of hours, we can pass out 500 religious tracts or invitations. We stayed for 3 hours and only 2 people would accept a piece of paper from us. They're very anti-religious. Many of them would step to the other side of the street so as not to walk by us where that we could talk to them and try to give them an invitation for a Bible study. Let's fasten our seatbelt again and now fly to Malaysia. Malaysia is another Muslim country. Now, no one has ever asked me, but if they were to ask me, I would say that Malaysia needs to be 2 countries. Because look at the 2 parts that's divided by so many miles with the ocean. And so there you've got West Malaysia, where that Kuala Lumpur is located. And then you have East Malaysia, where Kota Kinabalu is located. There's a large Islamic center there. Now, there's also several Hindus that pay a bribe to the Islamic government. We'll give you money if you leave us alone. And then here is Nick Rowe and his wife, Justina. Now, Nick, for many, many years, worked at the hospital. And there was a commercial on the radio that indicated that the U.S. government and the Malaysia government had made a deal that they were going to offer 12 scholarships. Someone could go to college in the United States to get extra training to come back to Malaysia and work at the respective job that you had. And so the hospital encouraged Nick to throw his name into the lottery. There were thousands of people that put their name in. But by the grace of God is that Nick's name was drawn. And so he won the 2-year scholarship to come to Iowa. And while he was in classes all day, Justina started listening to the radio, and there was a Church of Christ that had a call-in religious broadcast. People could call and ask questions, and they would study to see what the Bible said. She was enjoying listening, but she was afraid to tell Nick about it. They're from a Muslim country. And finally, she got brave enough, and she told Nick, and then Nick started listening to some of the taped broadcast. And then invited the preacher to come to his home. And they both were baptized here in the United States. And then they go back to Malaysia. And Nick had more zeal than what he had knowledge. So as soon as he got back home, he immediately wanted to convert his father, he wanted to convert his mother, he wanted to convert his aunt, he wanted to convert his uncle, he wanted to convert his next door neighbor. And about 8 people were baptized. And one night, while Nick and Justina were in bed asleep, there was this horrible noise, this horrible commotion. And there was a group of men that physically knocked down the front door, jumped on top of Nick in his bed, and they had screwdrivers and knives, and they started stabbing him. And with every time that they would stab him, they would say, "We don't want Christianity in our country. We don't want you to talk about Jesus. We don't want people to study the Bible." And they left him in a pool of blood, believing they had stabbed him enough times that he would die. By the grace of God, he lived. Now, he and I have traveled together a few times, and one time I saw him as he stepped out of the shower with a towel. And there's 17 holes in his chest where that they had stabbed him. But he loves God. And here is the church that meets in his home. They can't have a church building. They can't advertise. They can't be loud and vocal about we're members of the Church of Christ and we want you to come and study with us. Everything has to be in secret. I made 3 trips to Egypt. You're seeing me here on top of Mount Sinai. I went to study with this young man, Toddy. Jeremy went with me on one of those trips to Egypt. Toddy started studying the Bible on the internet. And then I was given his name and we started communicating, and I was trying to answer questions for him. And then, as I said, I made 3 trips just for one student. I want that to sink in for just a moment. I'm not interested in numbers just for numbers' sake. Now, in a moment, I'm going to show you then some other countries where that in Ghana, I had over 2,000 people as students. We rented the convention center. So at one place, I've got 1 student. Another place, I've got 2,000 students. I'm just looking for the students that have an open heart and that are honest and want to learn the Bible. Now, I'm happy to tell you that Toddy was baptized in the swimming pool at the hotel in Cairo, Egypt. Now, his father didn't know that. His father had told him, if you ever think about following Jesus, for the honor of our family, I will publicly have you killed. And so Toddy got a scholarship to play football. We Americans would say soccer. But he came to Florida College. And he's never going to be able to go back to Egypt. Because he sought from the U.S. government, he sought religious asylum. And so he can not go back. If he goes back, 2 things are going to happen. He'll never be able to return to America. And number 2, his father said he would kill him. And so Toddy is now in America. He finished up 2 degrees at Florida College and then did some studies in Arkansas. And he has visited many churches and told his conversion story of leaving Islam, following the Bible, following God. And so it's hard in areas like that. Now, as we visit Ghana, when we talk about some of the places here, after World War II, there were hundreds and hundreds of churches that were established in Ghana. And some of them are huge. Now look at this one. The attendance last week was 827. This week, 827. Last week, 713. The problem was the American missionaries went in there after World War II and had a couple of weeks of classes and baptized thousands of people. And then nobody went back. And so they were having trouble growing spiritually. They were having trouble understanding some of the Bible stories. They were having trouble training Bible teachers. They were having trouble establishing men that wanted to be preachers. And so I have agreed to make many trips. And as I said, the culture is different many times. In this one location, there was a letter on the bulletin board. There's a young man and a young woman that wants to get married. Now, do you know any reason they should not? Will they help each other go to heaven, or will they be a spiritual hindrance to each other? And so if you know why they should not get married, it would not help their spiritual life, then you let it be reported to the church. In many of the churches, that they have many members that are deaf. And here you can see some of your brothers and sisters that are singing with their sign language. Here's one of the classes that I was teaching, and we invited the men that wanted to train to be Bible teachers, song leaders, to learn how to do a better job in praying, that would want to be preachers, that some would want to develop as elders. And I didn't want to be mean and ugly about it. But I explained, I said, if you're not going to work hard, if you're not going to study, don't come. Don't take up the space if you're not going to really work hard. Is that we're going to study the Bible in 17 sessions, going all the way from Genesis to Revelation. We're going to have about 8 hours a day of Bible classes. Now, a lot of people, even here in America, a lot of people know about baby Moses in the Nile River, right? They know the story maybe about Noah's Ark, and they know about Moses up on Mount Sinai, but they can't put the stories together. And so I had a stack of index cards, and after you've attended all my classes, I just throw them up in the sky and let them fall all over the floor and say, now you pick them up and put them in chronological order. And so we tried to help develop a lot of preachers. And so at nighttime, I rented the convention center, and that's where we had 2,000 people. Is that so the daytime, we're trying to train the men that we can hope to be future preachers. And at nighttime, it's a gospel meeting for those that anybody and everybody that will come. And so things are improving. And then when we crossed the border into Kenya, as soon as you cross the border, you pay your entrance fee, you show your passport, and then you've got people walking the streets wanting to sell you bananas or wanting to sell some apples or something. Now look at the streets, not too modern, are they? And many of the church buildings that I have preached in are built out of elephant manure, elephant dung. And the roof is tin. We start our classes of the morning inside, but by about 11 o'clock in the morning, it's about 120 degrees inside that tin roof. And so we just come on outside. Some American Christians had given me some money and said, use this at your discretion. Buy whatever you think you might need at some time. And so we bought some plastic chairs. And so we can then have classes outside, and this is at the congregation around Tengola, and this was at Mumais. And as the shade would shift, we would shift our chairs. And so, again, not to have the comfort that we might have here in classrooms and all of the chairs and all. I was given the invitation to come and speak to a high school. They were going to have their exam on Monday. So Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, the students did not go home. Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, they stayed at the school building and studied together until they just couldn't study anymore and would fall asleep. And so finally, the headmaster, what we would call the principal, said, Bob, they need a break. said, can you come over and talk to them? I said, sure. What do you want me to talk about? And they said, the meaning of life. So we had a study on the book of Ecclesiastes. And some of the kindest, most polite young people that I've had the privilege of being around. And it was a great, great joy. I've made a few trips into Mozambique. Many Americans had never heard of Mozambique until the tsunami hit there. And it's a very, very poor country. There's a lot of political unrest. There's not hardly a day goes by that you don't see riots, looting. You can see a fire burning there in the background. And there's a lot of trash, a lot of filth. There's a lot of poverty. Some of the streets, you would think that you're on a roller coaster. When you look at going up and down, up and down. And so there are also some of the places where on the street corners they sell used clothing. I did not meet one Christian in Mozambique that said they owned anything that they bought new. Whether it's their shoes, their pants, whether it's a woman's dress, a blouse, a skirt, that they can't afford new clothing and new shoes. And so they buy the things that are secondhand. But I was invited for several locations. And there again, we did the preacher training, trying to develop preachers, trying to develop elders. You can see one of the classes we taught was the church's role in developing elders. I take a different position than some teachers. A lot of people just jump in and the first thing they want to do is let's talk about the qualifications. And I choose to say let's talk about their duty. Let's talk about their function. Let's talk about the work that they're going to do. And if you can understand the work, then you can better understand then the reason for the qualifications. In several of the churches, there are many people because of bad water, because of bad diet. There are many of the children that are born without all of the limbs. In this one particular congregation, there were 3 that had these little bicycles where you paddle it with your hands instead of with your feet. And then when he gets off of his bike, he uses his hands to push himself because the legs don't work. But he would get right smack up in front of the pulpit. Boy, he was right up there next to me and loved to ask questions during the Q&A section. And always had a smile on his face and always thankful for what God had given him. I was there for 21 days. Now, 21 times 3 is what, 63 meals that I had? Now, being a Kentucky boy, I love pinto beans, but not for 63 meals in a row. I had my choice. I could either have beans and rice, or I could have rice and beans. And that was my breakfast, and that was my lunch, and that was my evening meal for 21 days. But now you see, at least I was eating. Now sometimes in Zimbabwe, I work in villages where the typical Christian is eating 3 meals a week, not 3 meals a day. Many of the mothers confess to me they're putting sand in their children's food to keep them from crying so much out of hunger. And I said, but Mommy, don't you know that sand in the digestive system is going to kill those with children? And they said, well, Bob, it usually helps them live about 3 months longer. And so some of the places where I go, if Americans have given me money and allowed me to use it at my discretion, I have sometimes bought a goat and we would kill it and cook it. I have sometimes gone to a farmer and bought corn, and we would take it to the mill and grind it and make our own, it's called mealie meal. Many of my good friends in the north don't like grits. I know you wouldn't like mealie meal. But if you can eat a bowl of it on Monday, then Tuesday and Wednesday you can drink water and it swells up inside you. And that way you don't feel so hungry. There were not enough bowls or enough plates for everyone to eat at the same time. So we divide everyone by age and by sex. So the females that are the oldest get to eat first out of respect to them. And then after they eat, they can pass the plate then to the older men. And then we go then to the middle-aged ladies, and then to the middle-aged men, and you see what we're doing. And so here's just several of the men that are just waiting under the tree, waiting for their turn to eat. Now, when we look at countries like South Africa, like Mozambique, like Kenya, like Ghana, those were under British rule. And so because of that, the steering wheel is on the opposite side of the highway, and on the opposite side of the automobile, and you drive on the opposite side of the highway from what we're used to. They tell a joke in some of these African countries. Now, see, in Indiana, you know somebody is drunk if they're driving like this down the highway, right? Well, their joke in these African countries, you know when a man is drunk if he's driving straight. Because, see, many of the roads look like this. Now, see, that's my side of the road. I'm supposed to be driving over here on the left-hand side, but I've got to get over here in order to make it to my destination. This is the main street in town, and so nothing but red dirt. And so by the end of the night is that this white beard and white hair that you see is red because of the dust settling on me because we don't have a church building. We have our classes out under a tree like this. And so when you've been there, and again, we sometimes have to shift with the shade. And so at night, you're quite dirty. I've made a few trips into Chile and into Argentina. This is my friend Emilio, and he's standing in front of the big building where he used to be the pastor of this Pentecostal church. And he used to train people how to speak in tongues and how to fake people into believing that you perform miracles. And thankfully then, he studied the Bible, he learned the truth, and he was successful in bringing about 27 of the members out of this church. They were all baptized into Christ, and they started a Church of Christ there in their neighborhood. This was my friend Manuel. He had migrated from Venezuela. If you've been keeping up with news and knowing what's going on in Venezuela. So he and his brother left, giving Mommy a goodbye kiss. Mommy was a florist, but there was no electricity and there was no water. So she had to shut her business down. With no business, there's no money. With no money, there's no food. So Manuel and his brother came, and Emilio provides his meals for him. And he attended every one of my Bible classes. A wonderful, wonderful young man. He led prayers. He led singing. I asked him, I said, have you heard from Mom this week? And he said, no, there's no power. There's no internet. The cell phones are not working. And he said, I'd love to hear from her just to know whether or not she's okay, know whether or not she's eating. And then several more came in from Venezuela. And then one night after the Bible classes, all of the refugees asked me to come over to their apartment. And they wanted to fix some special Venezuelan food and snacks. And then one of the Venezuela girls started dating this young man in Chile. And she told him, she said, it's very important that you learn the gospel. If we're going to continue a relationship, it's very important that you become a Christian. And so he asked for a full day. And so after about 6 hours of Bible study, he said, I finally see the big picture. I finally understand it. And he asked if he could be baptized into Christ. And one of the Christians worked in a community swimming pool, and we got permission to go there in order to baptize him into Christ. Let me show you two pictures here and just make a prayer request. The lady on the left picture, has a brain tumor, and that has left her deaf. And so we had to either use sign language, use PowerPoint pictures like this, or handwrite it in order to study the scriptures with her. But she's trying to grow in her faith with the Lord, and we're happy for her. On the right-hand side, you can see Grandma and Grandpa holding the little boy, and he has had about 8 surgeries for his heart. Often his lips are purple because he's not getting enough oxygen through his system. And so just remember those 2 families. We don't like to get sick in America, but if we get sick, we have doctors. And if we're in pain, we can get prescriptions. And we have money that we can try to improve our physical condition. And they don't have these things. And so we need to remember them in our prayers. Here is another preacher that I've stayed in his home several times, and his sweet wife, and he's helping hold her up. She had just had a stroke, and she is taking some physical therapy and trying to ride a stationary bicycle to get the mobility back that she needs. And I just had to throw this one in just for the fun of it, because I go all the way to Chile, and I meet this household that everybody in that household had hats and T-shirts for the University of Kentucky. And you can see here, Luis is a big, tall guy, and he loves basketball. Now, I was there during the Final Four basketball game, and they didn't know it was going on. I mean, they love being big, they love basketball, but they don't often get to watch TV, and they don't keep up with the sports, and didn't know that the Final Four was in session. So just for the fun of it, we all put on our Kentucky things. But I was invited to teach a class, and we did have one little bitty 60-watt bulb that would burn, and we had classes all day and all night with the teenagers. And I enjoyed getting to teach them. They were very observant. They asked lots and lots of questions, and they were interested in knowing how to follow the Lord. At this congregation, you have to climb up the mountain. And so you're going to get your exercise just to get to the worship service. But it's worth it if you can make it to the top of the mountain. You look out then and you can see the ocean below you. And it's a great place. This is another city that we went to, Lancache, and this is what the church building looks like. You have to roll your clock back several years as you enter the city. There's not that much electricity in the city. Everyone cooks and does everything with wood-burning stoves. The family that I stayed with, here you can see her heating up the hot water. You can have coffee or tea, and she's a wonderful cook. She baked bread in that wood-burning oven. There's another church that is renting this storefront right on the corner, and this church is growing also. And so there's just a lot of good things that's happening in Chile. Now, Lord willing, in January, I will return to the Dutch island of Aruba. This will be my 12th trip to go to Aruba. It's one of the most unusual countries that you could find. Aruba is owned by the Dutch government. It is 15 miles off of the coast of Venezuela. It's only 19 miles long and 6 miles wide. Now let that sink in. That's not a big country, is it? It does have a population of 120,000 people. But when you look at that mountain, look at that island and understand how small it is. But only half of the island is allowed to be used. The government owns the other half. And the government does not want it to be developed. There are no businesses, there are no houses, there are no restaurants, there are no hotels, there's no water, there's no electricity on that side of the island. For this whole island, there is no river on this island. So how are you going to get your drinking water? And so they have had to pay for a water purification system. And most of the families on the island of Aruba pay more for their monthly water bill than I pay for my electric bill. Water is very, very scarce. Now, as a result of that, number one, you don't have land. Number two, you don't have water, so there's no garden. Everything for the island has to be imported. And it's probably one of the most expensive places that I try to go and preach. Is that, you get you a little box of Cheerios or Post Toasties, $8.50. A quart of orange juice, a gallon of milk, again, over $8. And so everything is very, very expensive. Now, the island first made its money by gold. And then when the gold was depleted, here you can see there's the abandoned gold mines. They then, after the gold ran out, they then discovered oil. And let me come back to that in just a moment. It's because of this oil that we now have Christians on the island of Aruba. Now, the third way of making money is through tourism. Now, the left half of this island is flat, beautiful white sand beaches. You've got 5-star resorts like this one. You've got the Hyatt, you've got the Hilton, you've got the Marriott, you've got Holiday Inn, you've got all the resorts there, the big buffets and all of that. The other side of the island is volcanic rock and giant cliffs like this. Now, as I said, it's a very small island, but such a contrast from the east and the west. And as I said, it can't be developed because the government owns it. It is a donkey sanctuary and a goat sanctuary. And the only reason that you would have the need to go to that side, if you're wanting to have a picnic, if you're wanting to go walking down on the beach on that side, or if you wanted to go and bury one of your pets. This is where everybody goes to bury the dead cats and the dogs. And so now let's come back to that oil refinery. It was bought out by the Exxon oil company. And so Exxon decided to send 10 families from Texas to go and work the oil refinery. 3 of those 10 families were members of Churches of Christ in Texas. So they get to Aruba and find out that about all you have the Seventh-day Adventist Church, you have the Catholic Church, and you have voodoo. And they said, well, we can't accept any of those. So the 3 families agreed that they would worship in their home and take turns, the 3 men would take turns preaching. After 2 years, one Sunday morning before they started singing and starting their worship, one of the men looked over to the other 2 and said, do you realize that this is our final year on our contract? At the end of this year, we'll be going back to Texas. And then he paused and he said, and when we leave, this island is no better off than it was when we got here. I've converted no one. I've not even invited anyone to come to any of our Bible classes. I've done nothing. And so they repented. And they prayed. And they contacted a gospel preacher in Texas and said, can you come and hold us a 2-week gospel meeting? And in that 2-week period, 7 people were baptized into Christ. And I had the good opportunity of meeting 2 of the first Christians on the island of Aruba. And I'll tell you what, brothers and sisters, there was one of the elderly ladies that made me just want to go hide in a cave somewhere and cry for a while. She looked me right in the eyes and she says, do you people in America that claim to be members of the Church of Christ, do you really think it matters what you believe? Do you think it matters what your faith is? Do you think it matters what church you attend? Then why don't you share it with people around the world? Why don't you spread the news? She said, I'm a Christian now. But she said, if you'd have brought me the gospel 40 years ago, I could have been a Christian for a long time. She said, when I heard the gospel messages, it was from the Bible. It was easy to understand. I was immediately ready to become a Christian. And I just wonder how many people are like that in other places around the world. It only takes two things to make a Christian. It takes the gospel of Jesus, and it takes an honest heart. It only takes those two things. But you see, I can't look at someone and tell whether or not they're honest. You remember the parable that Jesus told about sowing the seed? And it fell into 4 different types of soil. You remember that story? God did not ask me to be the soil inspector. God asked me to be the seed sower. Now, I have a lesson that I sometimes preach from the Gospel of John. And here was John the Baptist standing by the Jordan River. And he had 2 students with him. Now, you know, for 39 books through the Old Testament, the message was, someone is coming, someone is coming. And so the Jews had been hearing that. Someone is coming. There's going to be a new king. There's going to be a new Messiah. There's going to be a new Savior. Someone is coming. And there in the very beginning of the Gospel of John, John the Baptist, the cousin of Jesus, is standing with 2 men. And then he says, behold, the Lamb of God. Can you imagine the excitement that John must have felt? And Jesus comes up to these 2 men. And the first one that decides to follow Jesus is Andrew. Now, have any of you ever read any books in the New Testament that Andrew wrote? No, they're not there. Have you ever read a sermon that Andrew preached? No, it's not there. But what did Andrew do? As soon as Andrew knew this is the Lord, this is the Messiah, he went and got his brother Peter. Now, let me ask you a question. Have you ever read anything that Peter wrote? Have you ever heard about a sermon that Peter preached on the day of Pentecost that's recorded in Acts 2? May I suggest to you there would never have been a Peter if there had not been an Andrew. Just because his brother wanted to introduce him to the Lord. Then you move on down the same paragraph there, and it says, and then Jesus found Philip. And what does Philip do? He goes to his friend. He goes to Nathanael. And he says, come and see. Now, I'd like for you to memorize those 3 words. Come and see. I do not believe that at that moment Philip could have answered every question that a person might have. But he just said, come and see. Turn a page or 2 in your Bible and go to John chapter 4. Now Jesus meets this woman at the well. She's called a Samaritan woman. Jews hated Samaritans. Jesus asked her for a drink of water. She's in shock because Jewish men did not speak to Samaritan women. And then he says, may I have a drink of water? She's in shock again. Because you see, in their recorded history, it says for you to take something from a Samaritan would be equal to eating swine. And Jews were forbidden to eat pork. And so the woman is in shock. You are willing to drink water from me? And Jesus talks to her about living water. Now, if you drink out of this well, you're going to get thirsty again. You're going to come back here tomorrow, the next day, and draw more water. See, that was the woman's job. But if you drink of the living water, see, he's now changing it from the physical to the spiritual. And then you know how that story goes, don't you? Something was said about her husband. And she says, I don't have a husband. And Jesus said, well, I knew that because you were married and divorced, and married and divorced, and married and divorced, and married and divorced. And after all of these divorces, you're shacking up with a man now that you're not even married to. How does he know everything about me? She runs into town and tells her friends, I found a prophet. He knew everything about me. This must be the one in the Old Testament. Now here she was, number one, a Samaritan. Number two, a woman that's had all of these marriages and divorces and is now living in fornication. And she runs to town as a new preacher. But what does she say? Come and see. She couldn't answer their many questions. But she can give an invitation. You just come. I want you to meet the man that I met. I want you to come and see. Now, what if we decide this week, starting tomorrow, whether you're going to school, you're going to the office, you're going to the factory, you're working at the farm implement store, whatever you're doing starting tomorrow, what if you started saying to people, come and see? What if next Sunday, everybody brings a guest with them? You see, we need to be a friend to people because people don't want to study the Bible with strangers, but they will accept an invitation and study with a friend. So what if we try that? So this group of Americans established a new church on the island of Aruba. Since it was Americans, the first church, and here's their building, we call this the English church. Right outside the gates of the oil refinery. And before you know it, they've got 15 members. Before you know it, they've got 25 members. Before you know it, they've got 50 members. And then one of the older men says, well, things are going great here with our English church, but we need to start a Papamento church using the native tongue. And so here's the building that they built. It took them over 3 years to build this building. Number one, they did all the labor themselves. Number two, they had to wait for more of the contribution so they could buy some more concrete blocks. And so they would come and have a Bible study and their worship on Sunday. Then they would use Sunday afternoon to work on building the building. And so I've made many trips there. And this shows some of the teenagers where that I'm putting them through some pretty heavy classes, and they're taking an exam on this particular day. And then many times we have a lot of children and do a vacation Bible school, and so things are going well. Let's move now to India. The problem in India is that according to the Hindu scriptures, they accept 33 million gods. They worship everything. They worship the tree, they worship the moon, they worship the river, they worship the frog, they worship the dog, they worship the elephant, they worship the monkeys. I went to the monkey temple one day, and here were women with big baskets on top of their head, and they would throw this basket of bananas out, and then they would kneel down and pray to the monkeys. They don't believe that there was a beginning. They don't believe Genesis chapter 1. They believe that matter is eternal. They do not believe there will be an end. They teach reincarnation. So you live, you die, you come back again. And so it's hard to talk to people in this country. This is Thane and his good family. And Thane is the gospel preacher that I work with in Delhi. I've worked in many of the cities. I've moved fast over that map of India. I'd circle some of the cities where that I've gone to work, in Hyderabad and Ongole and a lot of the other locations. This is where the church meets on Sunday morning. Again, almost like the one in Sweden, they have just enough money to rent a building here at the YMCA just for Sunday morning. And then the classes during the week are held in people's homes. Now, this is the Central Delhi Church in their worship at the building that I just showed you. And then here are some of the classes that we had in people's homes. Now, in their little Sunday bulletin, my name was included. They said, pray for Bob's well-being during his stay in this harsh climatic conditions of Delhi. On this particular Sunday, it was 122 degrees. That's sort of hot. And the building is not air conditioned. And most of the homes are not air conditioned. But that did not deter us from having our Bible classes. It was just uncomfortable. Now, Americans from institutional churches started going there right after World War II, and it has been calculated there may be as many as 2,000 institutional churches in India. Now, these churches act like denominations. They don't act like what we read in the Bible. They don't act like what the Lord wants. There is one preacher in Hyderabad that has hundreds and hundreds of churches in America sending him money, and then he's the boss preacher, and then he doles out the money, and he supports over 500 preachers in India. It's like a pyramid system. That's not God's plan. And so, see, Thang studied this, and Thang started asking questions. Why are we doing it this way? The Bible says this. Some of them wanted to bring in instrumental music. He said, but look at what the Bible says. Some wanted to change the Lord's Supper. He said, but look at what the Bible said. As a result of that, the institutional church withdrew from him. And they said, you're causing trouble wanting to do everything according to what the Bible says. And so I go there to try to strengthen him and to encourage him. Now, sometimes as you're traveling around the country, the highways look a little different than what we might be used to here. Now remember, they too were under British rule, and so you were supposed to drive on the left-hand side of the highway, and you get behind some of these overloaded wagons, or sometimes you see one that's really overloaded. Or if you want a cheap taxi, you can buy a ticket to go from city to city on something like this. Now, when you're walking around the city, the streets are full of animals. Understand, they believe in reincarnation. So this might be somebody's grandmother. And the hardest thing for me, I ought to experiment with some of you after services. Go back here and I'll get a little piece of paper and let you try to talk, and I'll rub the paper up and down around your lips and see if you can still talk without trying to move that paper. You know, I want to get rid of that fly, but I can't kill that fly because that might be somebody's grandmother. And you can't kill a mosquito. That might be somebody's grandmother. And so you have to adjust with the culture. And I got myself in trouble because I asked the guy to take my camera and make a picture of me with this big bull. And that's the highest god that they have. And oh, they screamed. See that guy looking over my shoulder? I mean, if looks could kill, I would have been dead right then. Because I touched his God. And you're not supposed to do that. This is the church building down at Kothagudem. And they don't have pews. And so everybody sits on the floor with a little bit of money that was donated on this trip. We did buy some plastic chairs, and the older or the men sat in the chairs, and the ladies sit on the carpets in the front. You can see the beautiful colors that they wear. This is where they're cooking my lunch, and so we eat on the sidewalks like this. And then, fortunately, we went to the river for a baptism one afternoon. We were rejoicing. Oh, how wonderful this is to be able then to witness someone accepting Christ and being baptized. But after we baptized her and after we had prayers, I looked down by the riverbank and I saw all the bracelets. Now, I don't know what you would think if you would see that. But having made enough trips there, I understand the Hindu religion. And as soon as I saw the bracelets, I knew that that meant death. When a woman dies, everything that she owns is to be removed from the house. So all of her bracelets, all of her necklaces, all of her earrings, everything that she owns is scattered along the riverbank. They then bring all of her clothing, and it's scattered over behind the bushes. And then the husband cuts off all of her hair, shaves her head, and scatters that down to the river. And then the bed sheet that she died on, they wrap her corpse in that bed sheet and put her on a little raft and douse her in gasoline and catch her on fire and push her into the river. And so that is a typical Hindu burial. Now, moving into Vietnam, a communist country, each trip that I make, I can see a little bit more progress and a little bit more modernism. Lots and lots and lots of motorcycles and scooters. They've now got Starbucks, they've got McDonald's, they've got Pizza Hut, they've even got a Hard Rock Cafe. And so it's starting to look a lot more modern, but it's a communist country. And so you have to be in secret. So we went way, way out into the rural area. I couldn't even get there in an automobile. I had to rent a motorcycle to get out there. We go by one of the preacher's houses. He raises dogs in order to sell the meat to the restaurants. He sells dog meat and he sells the giant lizards. And so which one would you like to have for lunch? And but we built a small chapel. And we had one worship service, just one. We don't know whether they spotted it from an airplane or whether someone snitched on us. But after one worship service, the communist soldiers came in with their sledgehammers and knocked the chapel down and hoisted the communist flag and said, "We do not want Christianity in this country." Now, I'm of the age, I'm 72, so I was finishing high school during the Vietnam War, and probably the most hated war that the United States ever entered. And to this day, they ask me, "Why did you leave before you got the job finished?" Because the North was communist, the South was a free country. In the South, you had church buildings all over the place, you had religious bookstores, Bibles were freely available in everyone's home. The day that the American soldier pulled out and they hoisted that communist flag over the presidential palace, they destroyed every church building and they forbade Christianity to be in the country. But there are 3 preachers that I work with that are still preaching, but the churches have to be underground. They have to be in secret. And so we need to pray for them. As I said, I've made about 12 trips into Zimbabwe. This is just one of our classes. Many of these people, are you ready for this? Many of these people walked for 5 hours over the mountains in order to come to the Bible class. Many of these people are the ones that eat 3 meals a week. And so when we look at that, I'll show you some more pictures in just a moment. But in China, this is my friend Abraham, who is a college professor. And they're still using the songbooks that he wrote and the textbooks for the university that he wrote. But someone snitched on him. And so he spent 20 years in prison just because he would not deny his faith in God. They withheld water from him for several days. His lips were cracking, his tongue was swelling, his mouth was bleeding. And the soldier would stand there and pour water on the floor and said, "I'll give you something to drink if you'll deny God." And he said, "No, I'll die in this prison before I'll deny my God." the soldiers would pull his shirt off and then beat him with their belt. And on one day, they turned it around and beat him with the metal buckles. And one of the buckles hit him in the eye. He's blind now in that left eye. Now, he's under the misconception. He thinks I come to China to try to encourage him. No, when I'm with Abraham, he's encouraging me. He has shown me what faith is. Now, I'm sad to tell you that just a very few weeks ago, he had a stroke. And he's now bedfast. He's now incapable of speaking. And I don't know how much longer he's going to live. But he's been a great, great man. This was Thomas. He and his wife came to my classes every morning. And they wanted to learn to sing some religious songs. And then Thomas and his wife stayed up until 2 a.m. in order to handwrite their own songbook. We sometimes, the young ladies can curl up and we can baptize them in the bathtub. We sometimes have a few more problems in baptizing some of the men. And Randy can tell you about that later. But sometimes we use an inflatable swimming pool. And sometimes that we would try to rent a health club somewhere. Now, in the Philippines, there are 7,107 islands. It stretches from a distance equal from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. There are 68 different languages, 80 dialects and all. And so the challenges are great. After World War II, the American soldiers left the Jeeps, and they used those for like a taxi service today. They're called jeepneys. So you can buy a ticket to ride inside, you can ride a ticket to jump up on the side and hold your arms through the window, or you can buy a ticket to ride on the top. Now look at the size of those green onions. I love the garden, but I cannot get my onions that big. But I'm entitled to a 5-gallon bucket every day. You recognize that, Jeremy? That's at BO1. So when Jeremy was with me, is that there was not a shower, there was never hot water for 3 weeks, is that you're entitled to a 5-gallon bucket and a dipper. And so that's often how that we take our bath. The church building sits on this river that I call it Sewage River, because all the houses around, all of the sewage from all the houses are dumping into this river. Now, I hope you will understand, brothers and sisters, why I do not want to go into this river to baptize somebody. And so to try to lay out my budget, if I'm going to be there for 21 days, I try to figure out how much I'm going to need for transportation, how much I'm going to need for food. It's impossible to know exactly how much to budget for baptism, because we have to pay to go to a school that's run by the Catholic Church to use their swimming pool. And so you have to pay for the person that wants to be baptized. You have to pay for the preacher that's going to do the baptizing. And naturally, if it's a young person or a married person, then they got family that wants to go see it. And you have to pay for all of them. But now the church building here at Coppet Bahayan sits right on the edge of this sewage river. Now you can see the little floating tent there. A family of 8 live in that tent. In many of the places where Jeremy walked around this neighborhood, I remember one year I had about 6 college students with me from Florida College, and I took them for a walk, and they said, why are so many children out on the streets this late at night? I said, well, they've already had their sleep. Mom and Dad woke them up and said, now get out on the streets so Mom and Dad can lay down and sleep. Because the houses are so small and there's so much poverty that the children come in after school, do their homework, and then go to bed immediately while the sun is still shining. And then Mom and Dad will wake them up about 11 o'clock at night and say, now you go outside, play basketball, and then Mom and Dad can sleep. And so here you can see some of the poverty that's right around the church building. On this particular year that I went, the elders had asked that I talk about money, the Christian stewardship and talents and time, money management, how to budget, how to get out of debt, how to stay out of debt. What does the Bible say about money? Sometimes is that they had me to do the 17 lessons, the whole Bible, Genesis to Revelation. Now, Jeremy, this has changed since you were there. One of the elders works for an airline company. He's in security. And they were shutting down one of their big 747 jets. And so they asked Jerry, would you have any use for the seats inside our big jet plane? And so they took all of the seats. And so first class is up front. And so it's really a joke about the comfort of the seats. Nobody wants to sit in the back because the seats in the front are a softer leather and they're wider and they're more comfortable. But the church was very thankful for free seats. I also preach for the prisons there. I've gone to all of them, the minimum security, the medium security, the maximum security. And so here are just some of the pictures of some of the security camps. This is Kenneth that preaches in the maximum, and then others that preach in the other locations. In the minimum, you're allowed to have guests. And so now the wives of many of the prisoners are coming for the Bible study and worship, and many of them have been Christians. And so I had met 14 Christians that did not have a Bible. And so thanks to donations from some Americans, I was able to go to the Philippine Bible Society and was able to buy several Bibles to distribute. Some days we run into floods and you just have to wade through it and go on up the mountain if you're going to have a Bible class. I was able to teach at the National High School, and but then they often, about 4 times a year, the Philippines gets hit with a typhoon. And so here you can see people that have lost everything that they own. You can see some of the ships are now on shore. You can see how many are dead. Each black bag there represents a dead body. Here you can see the father that's bringing his dead child out. And then I started a foundation where that if Americans donate, we can try to provide in times of disaster. So here's some of the food that we purchased. And then it was distributed then to the Christians. And I don't know if you can read any of the signs that they're saying, a special Islamic code, which is thank you to the American Christians. Thanks to those that provided for us. But even with the storm, worship goes on. Even with water standing in the building, they still assembled in order to worship God on this particular Sunday. And so let me push this fast and get down here into Zimbabwe. That this is the start of a new chapel. And so they're counting the bricks as they make them. And they mix the dirt and the sand, and they mix the elephant manure with it. And then when they get enough, then they're ready to build their chapel. And right now would be a good time for you to take your hand and press that chair that you're in. And look at the difference in the comfort that we have in this building. How would you like to sit here on this pew for 6 to 8 hours? But they do it without complaining. I'm standing in the middle of the river. They've had no rain for 3 years. Nothing is growing. There are no vegetables. There is no corn. The trees are dying. That's why that I told you earlier that your brothers and sisters are eating 3 meals a week. In order to get water, you have to walk for a few miles to go to a pump. And then after walking miles to get there, you have to walk miles to get back. Except now you have the heavy water on top of your head. Now, I want you teenagers to notice all of these girls have shaved off their hair. These girls told me that for 3 years they've not had a bath. With water being that scarce, you use the water only for drinking or for cooking. You don't use it for bathing. The ladies will go behind the bushes and remove their clothes and take sand to rub on their body to get rid of the perspiration. These girls told me that they had never, one of the girls was 16, one was 18, and they said, I've never owned a bottle of shampoo. I've never owned a bar of soap. And so, again, little things that we often take for granted. My foundation had filled up this trailer, and we were carrying in vitamins, and we were carrying in antiseptic ointments, and we were carrying in used clothing, and we were carrying in cooking oil, and we were carrying in food for them to eat. And they stand in line, and over they express their thanks. The last two pictures I show you is not from eating too many Big Macs. This is what starvation looks like. This is when that you've not been allowed to eat. Brethren, I get emotionally attached to these kids. Of 12 trips, all of them except one, I've had to bury some of my kids. And so when you finish your worship service, this is the way that you say goodbye. Whoever's the song leader from his chair will start leading the song, and then he walks out the building. Everybody joins in the singing of the song. But he walks out, and he stands there first, and then the second person comes out and shakes hands with him and will stand beside him. The third person comes out, shakes with both of those two, and then stands beside him. You understand how it's working? No one leaves until you either shake hands or you hug everyone, and you're singing the song, God Be With You Till We Meet Again. But they know that next Sunday, when they come back for worship, there's somebody that's here today that won't be here next week. That's the reality of poverty. Someone is going to die because they're eating 3 meals a week. Today, as you enjoy your soup or your sandwiches or your pizza or whatever it is that you're going to eat, say a special prayer. Now, in closing, people say, well, what can we do? The big thing we can do is pray. I'm not going to have enough money to feed every person that's hungry in every country where I go. That's impossible. But if I can teach them the gospel, then I can promise them there's going to be a better home than what we've got here on earth. We need to pray for peace. As Paul says in 1 Timothy 2, pray for all who are in authority, so that brethren can lead a quiet and a peaceable life in all godliness and reverence. One of my students in China was just snitched on. Within 3 weeks, she would graduate from college. She's now been expelled because somebody told that she believed in God. They stamped her transcript. No graduation. You can't get a job. You can't get married. Your life is ruined. Why don't you commit suicide? In communist countries, they don't have the freedoms and the peace that we have. We need to pray for peace. We need to pray for the faithful saints like Abraham that you saw 20 years in prison, enduring persecution. Men like Toddy, whose father wants to kill him. Men like Nicholas in in Malaysia. There are people in Zimbabwe that live in poverty. We need to pray for the furtherance of the gospel, for the many newborn Christians around the world, so that they can grow in their faith. And we need to do what we can in supporting evangelistic and benevolent relief efforts, that we can give God the glory for what we try to do. This has been long, but you've been patient. I hope that I've helped you understand conditions around the world, and if we will stop and think, we should stop and think. Now let me say in closing, because we're getting ready to sing this song, that we often call it an invitation song. I don't think there's anyone here today that if you decide to become a Christian, that you're going to worry about losing your job. You don't have the fear that you're going to go to prison. But here's what I do want to say. If you choose today to become a Christian, you have to have the same convictions that the people in these countries have. God has to be number one if you want to go to heaven. Any weak person can be a sinner. It doesn't take much courage to go out with a gang and get drunk. Doesn't take much courage to puff on that marijuana joint. Doesn't take much courage to go to Walmart and steal something. But if you're going to be a Christian, that's going to take courage. So whether you're in Vietnam, whether you're in Indonesia, whether you're in Malaysia, whether you're in Zimbabwe, whether you're in America, you got to be ready to say, I'm going to leave the devil, I'm going to get on the Lord's side. And I'm going to give him my all. It could be that in an assembly like this, there's someone that's not yet a Christian. Maybe that you have studied in times past. You know what God asked you to do. You know you need to repent. You know you need to confess your faith in Jesus. You know that you need to be baptized in order for your sins to be washed away. Why would you want to remain in sin? Why would you want to hang that over your head to know that if you die today, you're going to go to hell? When that God says to you, I love you so much, I allowed my son to die for you. I want you to become a Christian. Are you brave enough today? Are you strong enough in faith today that you said, okay, Bob, I'm ready. We'll get one of the men to assist you, and you can be baptized into Christ right this moment. Or you got started on your journey months ago, years ago, something happened, you got off the path. Would you like to come back home? Let us know what's on your heart. Let us know how we could assist you. While together we stand and sing.